Welcome to Healing Childhood Trauma, the podcast for millennial women who are ready to heal from the past. Here, we have the deeper discussions on emotional well-being and practical tips that will empower you to transform your relationships and underlying anxiety from insecure to secure attachment. I'm Lizandra, your host and psychotherapist. I'm a little bit obsessed with human development, deep conversations, and finding the lesson even in the most challenging of circumstances. I'm very happy to have you with me on this journey of self-discovery where we unpack the past and heal in the present. Hello, my lovely. I hope you are doing well today. I hope that you have been enjoying these episodes that are all about the process of healing from trauma and healing from relational trauma and relational wounds and the emotional things that we don't always get the time or the space to talk about or reflect about in safe spaces. So I hope that this podcast has been able to help you on your journey with that. That being said, I would really love it if you could rate the podcast. If you are loving what you hear so far and you are enjoying the episodes, when you actually rate and leave a review about the podcast, obviously I am hoping that the review and the rating is positive, but it also helps for other people to be able to find the show, as the show is relatively new, and it would be great if more women have access to healing and have access to this kind of information that quite often we don't really get to have. We don't really get to have many spaces like this. So I would love it if you could leave a review. Let me know if you're loving the show. And if you don't already know, maybe this is your first time listening to me. I am Lizandra. I am a psychotherapist. I have been a therapist for over 10 years. I'm also a relationship therapist. I work a lot with trauma, attachment, and helping you to heal from the past. And I have also done a lot of my own self-work through therapy, through my own kind of healing journey of learning myself how to undo generational trauma and how to unlearn unhealthy patterns, and especially learning how to set boundaries without feeling guilty, without feeling responsible for other people's emotions. So if that is a bit of you, then you are absolutely in the right space. And I've got some really good news. At the moment, I do have availability to work with clients at the moment. So if you have been thinking about one-to-one therapy and you are based in the UK or EU, then do get in touch. I'm going to leave a link in the show notes so that if you want to book a free intro call just to see if we're a good fit, basically for us to just suss each other out if we're a good fit to work together, then I'll pop a link in the show notes and then you can book a free 15-minute intro call. And if I'm not the right person to help, I have no problems with pointing you in the right direction. Okay, that's all the official stuff out the way. Let's get into today's episode. Today, I really want to unpack and talk about father wounds and how that relates to our attachment wounds and how we also heal from that. So if you are aware that you have relational trauma and perhaps a difficult, complicated relationship with your dad, or there is some kind of emotional difficulty there, I just want you to have in mind whether or not you feel like right now is a good time for you to unpack this, whether right now feels like you're ready to go there. And if you're not ready to go there right now, that's perfectly fine. But if you are, I kind of just want to just hold space that sometimes unpacking some of this stuff and looking at it and understanding and getting to the root of why we feel the way that we do and getting to the root of our emotional pain, it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to sit with. So I just want to be able to hold space to acknowledge that if you find it hard to listen to this episode or you find it hard to just sit with the emotional heaviness of it, like I understand, I see you. And I hope you can just be very gentle with yourself in not only in this episode, but in any of the episodes that I talk about, because we are talking about things that are emotionally difficult for us to sit with. And it might mean that whether it is this episode or any other episode, you might need to be very mindful afterwards of being very gentle with yourself and being very nurturing and caring for yourself and pouring your cup, filling your cup, making sure that you are resourced and that you're looking after yourself and that you're not just unpacking the trauma and then just leaving that wound open and doing nothing to restore yourself or doing nothing to look after yourself. So I just want to acknowledge that. Okay, so maybe you've taken an attachment quiz and you've realised that you have an insecure attachment. Maybe you've noticed there's certain things in your relationship that bring up a lot of those abandonment wounds, and perhaps you respond to things in your relationship in a way that brings on a sense of shame even. And quite often we relate attachment issues to our romantic relationships, but what people don't really tend to realise is that when you have attachment issues, it didn't start in your romantic relationship. It didn't start with the person that you are in love with. It started before that. The root of your attachment issues pretty much always start in childhood. And it starts in that earliest relationship. And so if you have complicated relationships or you avoid relationships even, and romantic relationships don't feel safe or friendships don't feel safe, you don't feel like you can ever really be your authentic self, or you don't really feel like you can trust people, that often starts with the very earliest relationship that you have with your parents. And it relates to the needs that were not met. We develop father wounds as a result of having a father who might be emotionally absent, who might be critical, or maybe even an unavailable father figure. And quite often these wounds manifest from having emotional neglect, feeling as though you've been abandoned, perhaps emotional coldness and distance. And a lot of the time it is also inconsistent parenting. So sometimes they're there for you, other times they're not, and it happens far too often. And because of that, you don't have no sense of safety within that relationship. It doesn't feel as though when you need something, you get the support that you need. And it's not a one-off or a couple of times. It's something that happens consistently throughout your years of growing up. And the kind of relationship that you have with your father, or the relationship that you don't have, it plays a huge role in developing a child's sense of self and sense of self-worth. It also relates to security and self-trust. And it's also how unmet emotional needs from your childhood get carried into adulthood. And so you being able to address what your father wounds are is a really crucial part of your healing journey, because that's how you start to repair the wounds and build healthier relationships moving forward. So there are common patterns that are linked to you experiencing father wounds. If you've got a parent or a dad who is emotionally unavailable or inconsistent, it leads to you also experiencing feelings around self-doubt, feelings of inadequacy, and I tend to see people who struggle a lot with their own self-worth. And so this can have a really lasting impact on how you view yourself, how you view your relationships, and even your capacity to be able to feel and experience love. And often our father wounds impact our attachment styles. And so as a woman, you might develop an anxious attachment due to your fears around abandonment, or you might develop an avoidant attachment in order to protect yourself from experiencing future pain. These are all self-protective behaviours when we haven't had our needs adequately met from our earliest childhood experiences. And so that feeling of rejection or abandonment that we might receive as a result of a lack of relationship with our dads, it then triggers deep emotional wounds about being rejected or abandoned by our partners or by our friends or by people feeling close to us or the people that we are closest to. We develop a lot of self-protective behaviours, so we might overcompensate in our relationships. We might overgive because we are hoping that the more that we give, the more that people can see that we're showing up for them. Maybe we will have that feeling of safety. Maybe we won't be abandoned because we are giving everything. And so if we give love, if we give all of the love, maybe we can receive some of that back. And it's overcompensating because you're hoping that you won't have to experience that feeling of abandonment again. Or perhaps you go into people-pleasing behaviours of dismissing what your own needs are and just trying to meet the needs of others, because again, you're trying to avoid that feeling of abandonment. Or perhaps you might be somebody who tends to shut down emotionally as a different form of self-protection, and that tends to go into more of the avoidant traits and the avoidant types of self-protection, because again, our deep-seated feelings of abandonment and rejection almost feel like life and death. And that might sound like an exaggeration, but I've definitely heard things like this from my clients when we kind of get into trying to understand more about what those wounds feel like, what happens in your body, rather than just talking through trauma. Because a lot of when we have these abandonment wounds and we have triggers, a lot of this happens within our nervous systems, and our nervous systems go into either, fight, flight, freeze, appease. And so when we can connect more with what's happening within our bodies and learning how to self-soothe some of those very physical reactions, that can be a really powerful way to be able to self-regulate and to also be able to heal from trauma, because a lot of our trauma is stored in the body. It's relevant, but I've kind of gone on a little bit of a tangent, but I hope that's useful. A huge thing that I tend to see that people who struggle with father wounds have to deal with is their difficulty with being able to set boundaries and their emotional availability. And quite often people with those father wounds may struggle to set boundaries, and again, because they're overcompensating in hopes to gaining approval and having that validation. And they often tend to find themselves in relationships also with very emotionally unavailable partners. In relationships, it can feel as though you don't get the emotional support that you need, or that basically you're carrying the weight of everything in the relationship. Not only the practical side, but you're also almost like the manager of connection in your relationship. And so if you don't work on being connected with your partner, like spending time with them, celebrating anniversaries, anything that involves emotional connection, you will basically be in charge of that. If you need emotional support or you go through something difficult, you're not going to get the emotional support that you need in order for you to feel seen and in order for you to feel valued. And so quite often you can end up in a relationship with somebody who doesn't have the capacity to meet your emotional needs. A father's presence or lack of is an important part of a child's emotional development. It's also an important part of their security and their ability to form healthy attachments later on in life. And so if there is this lack, as in your dad is there, your dad might be in the home, but he's not actually present when he's there, or he's always working, or if he is home, he's just disconnected. It's like he's there, but he's not there. It shapes how you then respond to emotional intimacy and conflict. And those unmet wounds of not being validated, of not being seen, that you experience in childhood persist into adulthood. And so they can really surface in times of conflict, or those times when you need validation, and you might find yourself constantly needing or seeking the approval of others because it's relating to the way you weren't validated as a child, the way you wasn't seen. And when you haven't worked on these issues, without realizing it, you can end up repeating the cycle of those patterns of relationships because we repeat what we are familiar with. And a lot of the time it is this unconscious drive that we have, that we're not actively seeking out emotionally unavailable partners, but there is something about the comfort of that dynamic that means we can end up in that relationship without even realizing. And that's the nature of father wounds when we haven't addressed what they are or how they show up. And unconsciously, we end up choosing partners who mirror your father's emotional unavailability or those abandonment tendencies. And it's almost like we're trying to recreate that because we are trying to heal that in a lot of ways. we're trying to almost get what we didn't get in our childhoods. But because we are not addressing it consciously, we are seeking it out in ways that are unhealthy. We are seeking it out in the wrong types of relationships. As a therapist, sometimes what I hear is that, well, my dad wasn't around, so, I didn't miss anything because I didn't really know what I was missing, because you can't miss what wasn't there. And to a certain extent, I suppose, yes, that's valid, right? But also, because they wasn't around to, cause harm, because they wasn't around to mistreat you, it doesn't mean that their absence doesn't also have an impact on you. Just because you haven't had a father relationship, it doesn't mean that you're not missing out from experiencing that. Because relational trauma isn't just about what has happened to you, but it's also about what hasn't happened for you. And maybe the result of your dad not being there had a negative impact on how you felt about yourself, how it would feel even to watch a film where there's a loving dad present and it's a typical nuclear family, and you just, you feeling like you can't really relate to that. You don't really know what that feels like. You haven't experienced it. That can still lead to a lot of deep-rooted pain, and it can still impact how you have relationships and how you perceive men. Whether you think, perhaps they don't have any value because you don't understand, what do they bring to relationships? What value do they possibly add to your life? So not having your dad around also has a massive impact, whether they are there physically or whether they are not there physically. When you have a father wound, you might also have some internalized negative beliefs about yourself, some limiting beliefs that you may have internalized as a result of those father wounds. Typical things like, I'm not good enough, or I need to earn love, or people always leave me. And sometimes those limiting beliefs, they continue to affect your emotional health and your relationships. And so you can start to recreate those familiar dynamics from childhood when you are unconsciously choosing partners or choosing friendships that mirror that emotional unavailability. And perhaps part of you understanding more about these wounds and understanding more about yourself is identifying and paying attention to what some of those limiting beliefs are. Because we don't always know, or we don't always recognize them to be limiting beliefs. Sometimes they're beliefs that are so deep-rooted that we don't even realize that we think them, and we don't realize how much they influence our decisions and our choices and how we feel about ourselves. So maybe just pay attention to what some of those possible limiting beliefs could be, because these father wounds are often the root cause of where your attachment, your insecure attachment, whether it is anxious, whether it is avoidant, disorganized, fearful avoidant, whatever term you connect with the most. As I said, it doesn't start in your romantic relationships. It starts in childhood. It starts with your relationship with your dad, or it starts with your relationship with your mum, or it starts with your relationship with your earliest caregivers. In order to heal from these wounds, I think the first step is really to just acknowledge and validate and accept your experience, and just acknowledge the impact that father wounds has had on your life and on your relationships, and just validate that these wounds are real and that how you feel is entirely valid. And it may look like reparenting the inner child and perhaps giving yourself the same level of validation and love that you might overextend in your relationships, and turning some of that inwards. So you might not have received emotional support and love and validation from your dad, but in order for you to start self-parenting, you can start giving that to yourself through practices like self-soothing, affirmations, or even just journaling to connect with your inner child again. And the most important part of the attachment work is also working on the attachment that you have with yourself and working on the relationship that you have with you, because that emotional security has to start within. although we look for that in childhood from our caregivers, because that is no longer an option, we're adults now, it's something that we have to learn how to give to ourselves. And so when you learn how to have emotional regulation, and when you learn to start meeting your own emotional needs first, that's how we heal those wounds. That's how we reparent ourselves. And we have to start breaking the cycle of choosing emotionally unavailable people or partners and friendships and being in situations where our needs are not taken into account. So we need to recognize when we're drawn into very familiar but very harmful relationship patterns. And therapy is a very powerful space to actually be able to unpack your father wounds, understand them more, and work through your childhood trauma and reshape those negative or those unhealthy attachment patterns. And if you are ready to take that next step in healing, then do get in touch. I am accepting clients at the moment, and we can work one-to-one so that you can understand how your attachment wounds and how your father wounds have impacted you, and also work on developing your own methods of self-soothing and regulating your nervous system in a way that feels very personal to you. Because when it comes to attachment healing, there is no one size fits all. Different things work for different people at different times. And so if you have the capacity and you have the time to do that healing work, maybe try something that is you choosing you and doing something for yourself and giving yourself the gift of meeting your own needs and giving yourself the emotional and physical support that you needed now that you didn't receive as a child. So if there are 3 practical steps that you can take away from this episode to help you be able to heal your attachment wounds and to heal from your father wounds, I'm going to give you 3 practical things that you can work on. 1 is self-parenting. So giving yourself what you needed that you didn't get as a child. 2 is developing your self-awareness and understanding how your father wounds have impacted you and how that relates to your relationships. And 3 is boundary setting. Setting boundaries in your relationships and meeting your needs, and recognizing that your needs in relationships are also important too. Those 3 things are really good for healing from father wounds. So I do hope that you can take something from this episode in your healing journey, and I will speak to you soon. Bye. Thank you for joining this episode of Healing Childhood Trauma. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and empowering. Remember, healing is a journey and you are not alone on this path. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. And you can share this episode with a friend. Your feedback helps this podcast to reach more women who are ready to heal and build secure, healthy relationships and heal from the past.